Okay, this is our chapter on individualized education programs. Um, Chapter 3, Standards-Based Individualized Education Plans and Progress Monitoring is the title of the chapter. So, a little bit of history. Um, the the Individuals with Disabilities Improvement Act, which was the 2004 title given to um, special education law. Um, you remember it is originally it was called the 94-142, 94 being um, the number of the Congress. Okay, so it was the 94th Congress in 1975. And it was the 142nd bill that they approved. That's how you kind of read public laws. Um, the original name of it was the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Very, very long. It was a lot easier just to say 94-142, which is why it's kind of synonymous. Um, so the purpose is to protect the rights of children with disabilities and their parents, um, assist state and local education agencies in providing for children with disabilities, assist states in implementing a statewide comprehensive interagency system, and to ensure that teachers have the necessary tools to improve educational outcomes, and to assess the effectiveness of the things that we're doing in the classrooms. So, where do we start at? Now, when we're talking about high incidence and more mild to on the mild side of moderate severity, that's where we usually look a lot more at regular classrooms and resource rooms. Now, when we start going into the more severe populations, that's when we might want to think about looking at separate classrooms, residential facilities. That's where we have traditionally kind of thought that that's where we're going to be looking at. So and this is called Dino's Cascade. Evelyn Dino in like 1968 or 69 came up with this idea. And for those of you who have had other classes with me, when you've taken assessment and we've talked about um, curriculum-based management, curriculum-based assessment, her son, Stan Dino, he's the one who kind of came up with that in the late 80s and early 90s. So Evelyn Dino came up, the first continuum of services, or the first cascade, was where we looked at general ed with some consultative support. Now, you have to remember, many years ago, we did not ever put students with any kind of a disability into a classroom where there wasn't at least some kind of moderate support. So then we went to direct services, resource classes, self-contained, homebound, and residential. Now, in the expanded curriculum, we still have this consultative support. We added general classroom with co-teaching, the general classroom with extensions, um, and skill-specific resource classes. And so we've kind of expanded that idea a little bit. So we have to remember that the original 6 principles are still very, very important. Okay, so we have zero reject, FAPE, which I should have probably put in blue here, okay? Non-discriminatory evaluation procedures and standards. Making sure, well, FAPE is kind of right here, appropriate education, so it is in blue. Least restrictive environment, parent and student participation, and procedural due process. Okay, so these are all of our principles right here. The purpose of these principles is to make sure that we are including all students, to determine whether or not they have a disability, to provide benefit and progress, to ensure that all of the IEP outcomes ensure access to the general ed curriculum to the greatest degree possible. Now that's actually how it is stated in the law. They actually don't use the word inclusion in the law. Inclusion is a setting. It is not a legal precedent. And making sure that our parents and students have as much participation as possible. So we want to make sure that, and procedural due process kind of wraps around all of these, so that if there's something that's going on that doesn't seem quite right, and parents or students don't feel that they're being treated fairly, they have a way to manage this. Now, one of the things you have to realize about special education, and I know most of you have already realized this, but there may be one or two of you who are a little confused on this one point. I was having a conversation with my daughter just last night. She has a little girl in her first grade classroom that the parents last summer decided that they wanted to refuse services. So what happens when parents refuse services? It's a very, very serious issue. And what the law states that we must do, not that we can have the choice of doing, but that we must do, is when parents refuse services, even if they've already been receiving services and then they come back and refuse them, they get no more services. They have to be treated like any other child in the classroom. Now, can we give interventions? Of course we can, because we would give those to any child. We cannot give them services from, say, the speech and language pathologist. They get no more services there. No more services from the school psychologist. No more services from any related service provider outside of the nurse and counselor, because every student has services with the nurse and the counselor. So, what happens when their parents decide to refuse services? This little girl, her mother has, I think, realized that she does need some services, so she's gone to the school and said, I want her to have her speech and language services back, which was why we were having this conversation. And I made sure that, reiterated in my lovely conversation with my daughter, was that no, you may not give those services back. That would be a violation of federal law. Doesn't matter whether the state or the school or the district thinks that it would be a good idea. In order for that child to have her services back, a new evaluation procedure process must be gone through. So we have to completely, and that school district is going to completely have to redo that evaluation. So what do we do when parents are upset? We need to sit down very calmly and go over their rights. That's the first step. Always go over their rights. They need to know that they are being heard. Secondly, we need to let them know and go over that IEP with them again and ask them what are the issues that you see with this IEP? What are some of the issues that you would like to see changed? We need to strive to salvage that relationship and save the IEP. This is almost always in the best interest of the child. So we have to remember that our feelings need to be set aside, even if we feel that we aren't being understood. We have to realize that the parent and the student really needs to be able to participate. And so this is why we have these 6 principles. So some other issues that we have, and I've got some page numbers listed on here that if you kind of want to look and see where they are, because I'm actually following along my own notes here in the book. Okay, if you'll go to page 60, you can look at some we've got student, it's actually on page 61, sorry, determining how the student will be involved in the planning process. So student preferences, this is something that's very, very important. So if you look on page 60 though, we've got a really nice chart of some things that you might want to look at when you're writing these an IEP, especially for transition purposes. So looking at, and on this one they have the student, it's called Sam, and the person responsible, we've got the paraeducator for some of these things, the teacher for some of these things. Now, it might also be useful in an IEP to note where parents are responsible, where there might be a different type of teacher. So you might want to list what type of teacher, the PE teacher, the related personnel, who's going to actually be doing these things. And so then Sam is involved in family consumer science and band and beta, and he's got several different activities that he's doing. And these are all the places where they're going to have either a paraprofessional or the EA. Paraprofessional, remember, is the appropriate term, even though we often call them a paraeducator or a EA, or a teacher's aide. That's a very, very old term. So then we also want to know what those parent preferences are, and we're going to have to make sure that we ask parents, what are your preferences? And I did not state a page number, but if you look on page 59, you can see where some issues about communicating with parents. Okay, so and again, 58, there's some more information on student preferences. So we want to make sure that we have the student involved in the IEP. And again, like I've said earlier, the earlier we can get students into the IEP process, not just receiving from the IEP process, but actually interacting and helping with that process, the more they are going to be able to manage things for themselves. So we also want to be able to help them to plan for adaptations, okay? And we've got this 10-step plan here, and I would highly suggest going back and reading through these. I'm getting ready to send you guys your midterm, and it's going to have a lot to do with the standards-based IEP and how you manage some of these things. And you will be able to use the book, okay? But on page 70, we have some planning adaptations. And I know that I have a nice set of modifications and accommodations. It's a huge, huge list, and you're going to love it when you see it. I will see if I can find that and send it to you. So some steps for developing a standards-based IEP, and we're going to go back to page 57, where you have this table 3.1, okay, and it's got all 10 steps on here, very, very clearly written. I kind of copied them down here, okay, and then the next 10 pages or so, 10 to 15 pages, is where the Browder and Spooner kind of go through these one at a time and kind of give you a lot of really nice information and some ideas on how to do person-centered planning, grade level standards, how to write those annual goals, and the difference between an annual goal and a short-term objective. Okay, so for example, an annual goal, and I'm on page 65, might read like, given a variety of adapted text and read aloud, Steve will identify the major elements of the story, giving examples for each for at least 3 different types of text. Now, this is going to be a much higher level student, and so we might, for some students, we might have to kind of put that down into about 3 different goals or short-term objectives. Okay, so if you turn to page 67, got a couple of examples here. So your annual goal is the one that I just read, okay? Um, Now your short-term objectives are, Steve will identify the main character in 3 types of text for 2 out of 2 probes by the end of week 9. Okay, so 100% by week 9. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, you could put out of 5 out of 8 tries by week 9, or 80% accuracy by week 9. Steve will identify the setting of the text across 3 types of text for 2 out of 2 probes by the end of week 18. And it just kind of goes through here. And so you can kind of see how proper short-term objectives should actually be written. And then you always want to make sure that you've looked at that state assessment list, what you can do and what you cannot do. Because there are some interventions and accommodations that we make in the classroom that are not accepted on state assessments. For example, we may not read the test questions from the reading section to the student, even though the reading section may not be at the same reading level as the student is at. So for example, if Steve is personally and currently reading at the 4th grade level, but he is in the 10th grade, he's going to have a 10th grade reading selection. We may not read that reading selection to Steve. Now, fair or unfair, those are the rules. Progress monitoring. There are a lot of different ways to do this. One of the things that I would highly suggest, especially for students who have a variety of related service providers, is that each provider, of course, is going to have their own service page. And on that service page, they need to write down how many times in the month they are going to be seeing Steve. My suggestion, if they are going to see Steve twice a month for 30 minutes at a time or for 60 minutes at a time, then they should put down that they are going to see Steve twice a month for 30 minutes at a time. You can always go over the service. You may never go under. Now, it may seem a little, you may say, but why would we do that? Well, what if the service provider gets sick or has to go someplace on an emergency? There are all kinds, or we have vacation days. We still have to see them for that many days per week or per month. When I was a school psychologist with students that I saw every week, because there were many students that I saw every week, I would put down that I saw them 3 times monthly at 60 minutes a week, even though I saw them every week. Okay, that gives the school a little bit of leeway to make sure that you're meeting your requirements. But there were a lot of times that I had emergencies at other schools when I had students that were having extreme difficulties, I had to go and take care of it. That meant that sometimes you just have to rearrange your schedule, and sometimes if you have to go to a training, the students you're going to see on that day, we may not always be able to get back to it, but we do not want to be out of compliance, and this is a compliance issue. So, looking at this flow chart, okay, you're not going to find this in there. This actually came out of one of the older NMPED SAT manuals, okay, but I really like it because we actually still do use this kind of a format. The flow chart still works, even though we may call things a little bit differently sometimes. You're going to have your Tier 1 intervention. Now remember, from previous classes, your Tier 1 intervention means that's about 80% of your students in any interventions that you would normally do in the classroom are acceptable here. So if you want to give extra time or allow them to work on something over recess, you know, not all the time, hopefully, but that's a Tier 1 intervention. A Tier 2 intervention, this is about 10 to 15% of your total classroom population, i.e. the total school population. We should not have more than 10 or 15% doing Tier 2 interventions. These are more intensive, so it might be a small group intervention. Now, I don't have it on here, and somehow it got left off. I don't know why, but we also have a Tier 3 intervention, and this is about 5% of the students that are going to be getting interventions are going to have these more intensive. These are often kids that we're really looking very seriously at for testing for special education services. That is not in an initial evaluation setting. They're still in the regular classroom. But then we go from Tier 3, which isn't on here but should be, to the initial evaluation. Now, this is where we have the initial, it's not really the initial IEP. It's an IEP that is held to ask for permission to commence with the evaluation. Now, after we have done the evaluation, we come back and we have a new IEP, or we can table the other IEP and then we come back and we finish it within 60 days. It must be done within 60 calendar days, not school days, calendar days. So that's when the educational diagnostician or the school psych or the SLP, whoever it was who did that evaluation, is going to come back and they are going to give evidence as to why the student does or does not qualify for those services. Now, this evaluator does not have the right to say they get services. No, that is the IEP team's domain. And so then, if the answer is yes, that they are indeed eligible for the IEP team to consider giving them an IEP, then we start on IEP development. After that, we go to implementation, and in that implementation, that's when we're going to want to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row, basically. So we're going to want, that's when we look back at, let's see, it's the very beginning of this chapter. And if you look at these IEPs at the very beginning, like on page 45, the individual education plan with Jabril, which is actually part of your discussion board this week, and I'm going to actually move that discussion board into a homework assignment because the discussion boards aren't working the way I want them to. And so you can kind of follow along with this standard-based IEP and how they've actually written it. Okay, and so it tells you who's going to do what, how they're going to do it, what are the goals and the short-term objectives. So it goes through all 10 of those items. Then, every once in a while, we're going to have to review and revise that IEP. It needs to be done annually, because if they don't need it revised, then why do we have it? That's always been my question, okay? We also need to reevaluate at least every 3 years. Now, most of the time we don't have to do a full evaluation. Sometimes we do see a new area emerging and we have to do a full evaluation so that we're sure that we know what we're talking about. And again, if we do a new eligibility determination and we find they're not eligible anymore, we must exit them from services. But if they are found to continue to be eligible, we continue those services. So some other provisions of the IDEA, we might have services for preschoolers or infants and toddlers. We always want to make sure that we look at that assistive technology piece. Now, many of our students with severe needs do need assistive technology, so it's awesome. It's also very important to make sure that we have that assistive technology person helping out with evaluations. We want to look at universal design for learning. And many of these children often qualify for ESY, or Extended School Year Services. And again, we always want to look at FAPE. There are a lot of ideas about what does FAPE really mean. FAPE is that we educate a student to the best of our ability as much as they possibly can be educated. And we also want to make sure that we are disciplining students with disabilities. Now remember, discipline does not mean that we are punishing them. We are building structures so that they have a better way of managing their frustrations and so that they can advocate for themselves. And we always remember that they all have a right to education. So, who does the IEP provide for? Now, many of you are teaching, and so this is kind of a review, but the IEP serves students from 3 to 21, and actually the IFSP serves students from birth through age 5 or into when they start kindergarten. We look at individualized programming. The IEP must be evaluated annually. The IFSP, or the Individual Family Service Plan, must be evaluated every 6 months. And we need to be able to meet all of their school-based needs in an IEP. Now, the IFSP goes a bit further. It has to do, you usually have access to a lot more services with a more generic and a much easier to meet exceptionality. Okay, so that's what the DD-PRE is for. Basically, if we think that they might have issues, they can almost always get services in the IFSP. And we have to remember that availability of services does not determine whether they are included on an IEP. Basically, what that means is if a student needs services, they have to put them on there. Even if they're available or not, we have to find a way. And the state has money, all right? They do have money. They're 15% of the money that is sent from the federal government for each and every child who has an IEP goes into a pool. That pool takes care of very expensive things, okay? Things like standing wheelchairs, okay? Communications boards, electronic ones, So there, we just have to be able to find out where that money is at. And each IEP is individually determined, so we have to be able to adequately. I'm having trouble talking today. Communicate what is in that IEP, why is it important, and how are we going to help this child. So the purpose of the IEP is basically a roadmap. How are we going to help this student with instruction and delivery of the services that they qualify for? And we're going to also look at strengths and needs. Strengths always come first. We don't look at a child as to what their weaknesses are, because that's a medical model. We look at it from a strengths perspective. And then parents and educational professionals must agree on the delivery of the services. This is why we need to be talking to parents. So we have a lot of different components. We have present levels of academic achievement, functional performance, behavior, measurable annual goals. How are we going to assess them in the different types of assessments that we have? Supplementary aids and services. Are they blind? Do they need some kind of special computer if they have low vision, versus do we need a hearing aid if they are deaf for use at school? We also need to know any assessment accommodations, and we have to have those like 6 weeks before any state testing goes on, because we used to have to have them in place many years ago, and the federal government pretty much put a stop to that. So we have to have them 6 weeks in advance now in many states. We also have to have a projected date. So for example, if we have an IEP today, and today is Wednesday, the projected date for the beginning of services would be tomorrow, which is Thursday, and it would go for 1 calendar year. Now, if we do it on a Friday, of course, the next day is going to be a Monday, okay? And so if it's at the last day of the school year, the first day of the next school year is going to be our projected date of services. Now, remember, the federal government says at age 16, the individual transition plan must be developed, but every state says the age of 14. So who participates in the IEP team? Parents. We have to have a general education person. We must have them there. A special educator, usually that is the case manager, but sometimes we have more than one special educator at the IEP. A school system representative. Now, that could just be someone who has been trained to sign off on IEPs. Generally speaking, it's going to be the assistant principal or principal. If you have an evaluation, you either have to have somebody who can present the evaluation information, i.e. the person who actually did the evaluator themselves, or someone who can just present it for them. Anybody that the family feels should be there, and the student whenever at all possible. So we're going to review the formal evaluation and current levels. We're going to share our visions from the parent, the student, and the teacher perspective. We're going to look at placement and services. We're going to look at those priorities, and we're going to translate those into goals. Determine placement, any supplementary aids and services, related services, modifications, and special factors. So this looks like a lot, but this is a short list, okay? The average IEP covers about 200 different laws in every state. So we've got the steps in our IEP process. We have a pre-referral. That means this is in the classroom before the student is tested. That's what those tiers are actually to help us do. Then we have the referral packet. When you're completing a referral packet, or when you are accepting or helping the gen ed teachers do the referral packet, make sure that all of those questions are answered, including the referral question. Don't just give the evaluator, they're having difficulties, we think they need to be tested. That doesn't tell us anything, okay? We need to know Johnny's having a lot of difficulties with reading and comprehension. That tells us that it's a learning disabilities issue. Or it could be Stephen really has a lot of difficulties with his behavior and tends to melt down when he feels anxious. That tells us that he needs to have an emotional evaluation. So, whatever the issue is, we need to make sure that the evaluator has a very clear roadmap as to what they are supposed to be looking for. Now, if you're not sure, give the symptoms and say, you know, these are kind of indicative of these different areas, so that the evaluator has some idea as to that they're going to have to do a little bit more work to find what the whole problem is, so that they can find out what that child is actually eligible for. And remember, don't wait till the last minute. Evaluations tend to pile up. We're in October now. This is when evaluation paperwork usually starts trickling in at the end of the month. As soon as you have a child that you think has issues with learning, with behavior, any kinds of special education issues, you need to start that paperwork immediately, because it's going to take a little bit of time. And keep notes on your interventions. My suggestion, get a spiral notebook. Spiral notebooks, I love them because it's very difficult if we somehow wind up in court, which we would always hope that we would not. We would want to make sure that those interventions have been written in a way that we cannot go back and recreate them. Now, we might want to print them out or type them out to send to the evaluator so they have a good copy, but you want to have a good spiral bound notebook. And because it's very difficult to recreate a spiral notebook, because generally speaking we use different handwritings at different days. When we're tired, our writing cursive or print is going to be different on any given day, and people can really see that. We also tend to write in whatever we have available, so it might be blue pen one day, black pen another, pencil on another day. So that's really, really very difficult to recreate, and it's important to think about these things. We don't like thinking that we're going to wind up in court, but sometimes it happens, and we want to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. The reason many school districts lose lawsuits when it comes to special education isn't that they haven't been doing their job. It's because they didn't write it down. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So also, we need to figure out how we're going to develop that IEP, how we're going to implement it, and how we're going to go back and reevaluate. So, and I know this is kind of like overkill here, but these are very important notes that you want to always keep in the forefront. Present levels of performance. We must always keep those and know exactly how students are doing. This is one reason why a curriculum-based assessment is so very useful. Measurable annual goals. So we always want to do those academic and functional behavioral goals. How does their disability influence their participation and progress in the gen ed curriculum? Are they able to take advantage of that? If not, we must say why and why not, okay? Modifications and supports. And if they're not going to be participating in the general ed classes with their non-disabled peers, we have to be very clear as to to that, and I've said that twice now. So, um, again, district-wide testing, projected dates for initiation, transition, and this is something that's very important, especially for our students with severe needs. Transfer of rights at the age of majority, which is 18 in all states. We also need to remember that even though they may have a severe disability, the rights are going to transfer at age 18 unless the parents go to the courts and ask for an extension. And so we have to have reasons as to why we would do that or why we would support that. And progress must be measured, and we must inform parents. And this is one of the reasons why many times parents do want to discontinue services. It's because they don't know that their child is actually getting anything out of it. So accommodations, we have to look at what kinds of accommodations or modifications are they going to be using or needing. And this could be a simple change in how it's delivered, or it could be a shortened assignment as needed. So enlarged text, word processors, we might need an interpreter. A modification, now the big difference between accommodation and a modification is if we have a child who must have this accommodation in order to access the curriculum, then we call it a modification. Or if we are changing or altering the assignment or text in any way, now I'm not talking about just, giving it to them in a different language. That's an accommodation, generally speaking. But a modification changes or alters the standard for learning as well. Okay, so I've gone over a lot of this information already, but just want to reiterate that the purpose of the program is to make sure that all of our students have a free and appropriate public education, that the information is provided within their LRE, least restrictive learning environment. So that doesn't mean that every child is going to benefit from inclusion, but it doesn't mean that every child should be in self-contained classroom either. So we need to make sure of what area, of what setting this child is going to benefit the most from. And so we need to make sure that we expect outstanding results. Okay, so we have to have high expectations. And so again, you can kind of go over this. I'm not going to go over all of them because it's in the book, okay? FAPE, zero reject, and this is where we are looking to make sure that we haven't missed any children that need services. Most school districts are required, I think all school districts are required to have a child find office. So this could be, and they work with parents and doctors in the community to make sure that they aren't missing any kids, because it is a federal law that all children will have access to special education services if they are eligible. Procedural safeguards. We have to give it once a year. However, we might want to go over it more than once a year whenever we have the opportunity. Anytime there's an initial referral, anytime we have an IEP, anytime they request a new evaluation, especially if there's a due process hearing coming up, we want to talk about it, and anytime that the parent just requests to go over their parent rights. And sometimes we might say, hey, let's go over those parent rights. I just want to, we need to go over these at least once a year. Take some time and get to know the parents and go over that with them. Now, just because the school district posts the rights and the safeguard notice on their website, that does not mean that we don't talk about it. It's usually written in like number 3 font, okay, which is difficult for anybody to read, and in legalese. So if you think special ed language is difficult to read, just try reading legal language. And so our procedural safeguards, we have to have timeframes for filling due process hearing requests, an opportunity for resolution requests, information on how to go about getting mediation, which is um, a legal standard in almost every state, and the time frames for lawsuits, because there are time frames. We also want to make sure that parents are members of the IEP and the school teams, that they receive notifications about things that schools are going to do about their child's education. We can't just go off and do it. And we have to realize that parents have the right to use dispute resolution techniques, which, if you look here at the bottom, we've actually got 4 down here, okay? So we've got time frames, we've got resolutions, we've got mediation, we've got lawsuits, okay? And according to FERPA, which is, you guys are familiar with FERPA because, like, if your parents come in to ask us questions about your grades, we can't do that. That's FERPA at the university level for the most part. But it was actually written to make sure that parents in the elementary and secondary under the age of 18 usually have access to school records. Back in the 70s, parents didn't all the time have access. School districts did not have to give parents any access to school records, and so there were a lot of incorrect things put into school records. We have to be very careful of those things. And again, those IDE rights transfer at the age of majority. Now, in appropriate education, again, an IEP 3 to 21, IFSP 0 to 2, but we usually do the IFSP through until they're about 4 or almost 5, getting ready to go into kindergarten. The IEP needs to be in effect at the beginning of the school year. The IFSP describes the services both the child and the family will receive. That's why it's called family plan. The IFSP should be developed within 45 days of referral and reviewed at 6-month intervals. And the IEP is reviewed and revised at least once a year. And again, those procedural safeguards, one other thing that I haven't mentioned, and I'm glad I saw it right here. It's a little out of place, but we have to give notification 10 school days about meetings and other important events need to be in writing. Unless the parents say, let's go ahead and hold that meeting, we have to give them 10 days. We can now say they don't make it at the first meeting, we have to reset the meeting. We can do that twice. In actuality, we have to do that twice. So say you have a parent, you set the meeting, they don't show up, you set the meeting, they don't show up. When we set that meeting that 3rd time, we're having the meeting. Okay, we still have to give them 10 days, but we're having the meeting. Now, how do we get a hold of them? Communications, it has to be in their native language. It has to be free of educational jargon. We cannot leave a message on the phone. We must talk to them. Send it home in a note, or my personal favorite is mail it to them in certified mail, so they actually have to go and sign for it.